Oh, wait, I got it. Okay. There we go. Okay. Well, Jay Baba, everybody. Welcome to the late night chat. Tonight we have a special guest, Laurent Weichberger, who actually is the room next to me. So I'm now staying with Vanessa and Laurent. So if you hear the echo, let us know. No, I'm kidding. There won't be any echo. But anyway, so Laurent, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you, what you're doing here tonight. You just stumbled on this here website and you're the special guest.
I've been found. I was lost and now I'm found. Baba found me in New York City in 1986 when I was 17 years old, and I dedicated myself to him. I surrendered to him, and all these years later, I'm still with him trying to figure out what this all means, but it's going well. Thank you.
I think we're all on a similar journey. So Laurent just released a new book that Peter and I were hoping that he would talk about because it's pertaining to the life of Don Stevens. Oh, that's cool how your green screen is. We can't see your whole book, but we can see Don's outline. Good. So Laurent, do you want to tell us a little bit about your book and then maybe read from the book, or if people have questions about the book, just a little explanation of it would be great.
Yeah.
Oh no, I think Laurent, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Okay. I met Don in 2002. And at the time I said to him, listen, I happen to know that you've never written a biography and there's no, capturing or, record of all your incredible stories in life with Mary Baba. So if you should leave this world without having done that, it would be a real detriment to the new humanity and to society at large. You've got such incredible wisdom and experience. So I would encourage you to do that. And then I said, if you say you're not interested, I would say I would help you to do it. And he responded maybe a day or two later saying, thank you for your message, but I'm not interested. And then I think about a month later, maybe a few weeks later, after we had spent some time together in Myrtle Beach at the Mayor Baba Center, he wrote a message out to his close circle of spiritual companions saying, Laurent's going to write my biography. I'm authorizing him to write the biography. So he changed his mind. And I spent a lot of time with him. I moved to England to research his life with him. And I spent time with him in London and in Paris. And we traveled around the world together doing Baba work for years. So I worked with him for 9 years and was able to put together his biography. It took 20 years to put it together. It's 886 pages. It's got 90 chapters and it's done. So we're going to have a book launch party here in Asheville, North Carolina on Saturday at 5 p.m. And I happen to remember a lot of the stories. So I don't really think I need to read from it because I've been in it so deeply, but I'd be happy to tell some stories if anybody would like to hear stories.
Yeah, I want to, if you wouldn't mind, would you give a little bit of background about Don Stevens and his life with Baba?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Don Stevens was born January 14th, 1919 in Nevada, in a very dusty sand hill town where there was absolutely nothing except a train station. And he really came from poverty into an incredible opportunity, both through scholarship and mentors and his own intelligence and wisdom. And he eventually went to Black Mountain College here in Black Mountain, North Carolina, and then Johns Hopkins University, where he became a chemist. And then he got a job at Standard Oil of California, the division which became Chevron Oil. So he worked in big oil. And at the same time, he was spiritually seeking and he decided upon Sufism. So he joined Hazrat Inayat Khan's Sufi order under Rabia Martin, Murshida Rabia Martin. And it was Rabia Martin who was also seeking for her master because Hazrat Inayat Khan had passed away. So Rabia Martin had found Elizabeth Patterson and Narina Machabeli and was visiting them in New York City. And she became internally convinced. She had full conviction in Avatar Meher Baba in his divinity. So she wrote to Baba from New York, asking Baba to please take her as, you know, his disciple. And he said yes. And then she said, look, I'm, you know, in charge of the Sufi order of Hazrat Inayat Khan's lineage. Would you please guide our order? And he said yes. So she went back to San Francisco and she gathered all her students together. There weren't that many at that time. I don't know the exact number, but it's probably around 20. And she said to them all, listen, I've put myself under Meher Baba's guidance, and I am putting the order under Meher Baba's guidance. So you all have 2 weeks to decide whether you want to stay with me under Meher Baba, or I'll release you from your vows and you can go your own way. And Don told me this was really a conundrum because he had a deep connection to Rabia Martin, but he didn't know anything about Meher Baba, nothing. He had never heard of Meher Baba. So he started to try to research in that 2 weeks about Meher Baba. And one of his very close friends, Stuart Edward White, who was a well-known writer and adventurer, lent him a book called A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton. There's not one but 2 chapters about Meher Baba in that book. But unfortunately, it didn't help Don very much because Paul Brunton was very critical of Meher Baba. And when Don found out that Baba was keeping silent, he didn't like that at all. He said, Don was very colorful in his language and in his communication, but he said he thought that was one of the dumbest things he'd ever heard. Why would a spiritual master who's trying to change the world keep silent? That seemed like self-defeating. So he didn't like this silence part. And he didn't really understand Meher Baba. So he, even before the 2 weeks was up, he approached Murshida Martin and he said, listen, I don't know how to make this decision. Everything I do to research doesn't really help me. It might even be making it worse. I am totally at a loss for how to proceed here. And he kind of let off some steam, and Murshida Martin said, are you done, Don? Did you have more to say? And he said, no, I think that's what I wanted to say. And then she said, well, Don, I have a question for you. And he said, what's that, Murshida? And she said, Don, how can the drop measure the ocean? And he said, you know what? You're right. I don't have the capability. But if you feel that that's what we should do, I trust you and I will go with you. And so he trusted Murshida Martin and she brought him to Baba. That's one of the many stories in the book. Thank you for letting me share that.
That's amazing. So at any point, if you guys have any questions about the book or stories or encounters of Don Stephens that you've heard, raise your hand and feel free to ask Laurent. But until you guys put your hands up, I'm going to cue Laurent up for some stories to share about, or share some of the stories that are in the book. So Laurent, would you be willing and open to sharing some of the experiences that Don had directly with Baba?
Yeah, sure. I think one of my favorite ones is, I'm going to fast forward to when Baba asked him to work on the discourses. Many people don't really know how these projects came about, but in this particular case, Don was asked by Murshida Deuce, because Murshida Rabia Martin had passed away and Ivy Deuce had taken over. He was asked by Murshida Deuce to help with these hippies who were showing up in San Francisco, looking for information about Hazrat Inayat Khan and Meher Baba. And Don said, well, he was so taken aback by their appearance, first of all, that he couldn't focus on what they were asking. He was just stunned by how they showed up and presented with their long hair and their beards and their clothing. And he just didn't know what to make of it. So he said to me, you know, I had to not look at them and say to myself, wait a second, Don, they're asking really important questions. Forget about how they look. Pay attention to what they're asking you. That was his inner dialogue. So he said they were sincere, intelligent, open-hearted, wonderful people. And they were asking this, that, and the other about Hazrat Inayat Khan and Hazrat Inayat Khan's music and writings and who is Meher Baba. And so Don gave them classes. He put together classes for them, first for the first 4. Then he said they came back the second time and there was 8, and they came back the next time and there was 20. And then when there was about 30 of them, he said, stop, you can't keep bringing more people. There's too many people coming. And so he would go to India. Of course, Don would go to India, and Baba would ask him, what's going on? You know, how is it going? And Don said, well, Baba, there's this new group that's very interested in you, and they're known as hippies. And Baba was extremely interested in the hippies. He said, tell me about these hippies. And so Don explained everything that I just shared. And then Don said, you know, we've gotten to the point now, after going through basic mysticism and previous advents and, you know, answering a lot of their questions, where we're now reading your discourses together. And they love your discourses. And of course, Don's old school language was they really cotton on to your discourses. That's how he would talk. But, you know, they really loved the discourses naturally. But Don also felt the need to be honest and frank with Baba. So he said, but Baba, you know, there is something I should mention, which is that the style of the discourses, the way Deshmukh wrote the discourses for you, is like an Indian English, right? So there's 5 volumes of this Indian style English. And sometimes we have to reread and discuss things quite a bit to get the full meaning of it. He said, you know, you have so many wonderful lovers in both America and England and Australia who could easily rewrite these discourses and edit them in a more Western English, that they would be much more easily consumed and understood by the Western young people. And Baba said, that's a great idea, Don. I want you to do it. And he pointed right at Don. And that was the first time he had fallen into that trap where Baba put him to the project that he suggested. So he put his nose to the grindstone, as he would say, editing these 5 volumes. And, you know, couple things came out of this editing of the discourses. There's 2 primary stories. I don't know if I'm allowed to tell them both. We'll ask Margi.
Yeah, please do.
Tell them both? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just make a note to tell them both here. Well, they're so powerful. And so the first one is that Don said, you know, Don, you know, Baba, I'm confused when I'm editing the discourses. So by the way, the entire story of Don's life with Baba is his speaking honestly and frankly with Baba and bearing the consequences of it, which were beautiful. They're beautiful results that came from this honest and sometimes casual dialogue between Don and Baba. So Don says to Baba, you know, I'm editing your discourses, Baba, and there's something I don't understand. I'm rather confused about. And Baba said, well, what is that, Don? And Don said, well, you see, when I was under Murshida Martin in Sufism, before it came under your guidance, I was meditating with a meditation she had given me. But then when you took over, you took away my meditation and never gave me a meditation again. But then I'm editing your discourses, and there's not one, but 8 discourses on meditation, more than any other subject. I can't reconcile how it could be so important to you that there's 8 discourses about it. And I was meditating and you took my meditation away. So Baba says, Don, that is a very good question. And I can explain this to you. He said, you see, I am the avatar. And as the avatar, I have to plan for the future of humanity until I come again. And so right now, while I am manifesting, and when the avatar has manifested, it means the path of love is wide open to all of humanity. And of all the paths, that's the highest path and the surest path. And during this time, when the path of love is wide open, it's relatively a waste of your time to meditate, because I want you to love me. But the time will come in the future when gradually the path of love will begin to narrow more and more, until only heroes on the path will walk the path of love. And at that time, humanity will take the other paths available. And of the other paths available, meditation is certainly one of the highest paths. And it's for that time that I've written these discourses on meditation. It's not for now.
Wow.
Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. That's amazing.
So that's the first story. That's called The Path of Love. The other story is that you can imagine editing 5 volumes of discourses from Indian English into a more Western style. Don was doing this very carefully, and it took quite a bit of time. And he said every time he would go to India, Baba would see him. And of course, the first question would be, when's the last time you used the toilet? And do you need, a laxative? And if he hadn't used the toilet, Baba would order this orange laxative from one of the mandali, and Don would drink it in front of Baba to, get him to be regular again. And he would say, how did you sleep? When was the last time you slept? Don said it was always first about, how's your body? How have you slept? What's your digestion like? It was not esoteric. And after everything had been settled and Don was, grounded and back to being somewhat human and sane, from all the travel, because back then it wasn't a nonstop flight. It was stopping. You couldn't go to India without stopping every now and then to gas up. And there was many, many stops to get to India. Anyway, it would have been a lot of ordeal. After Don would get settled, eventually Baba would say, how's that work coming on editing the discourses? So, Don would say, well, Baba, it's coming along. It's quite a bit of work. And Don was a full-time vice president oil executive traveling around the world for his oil deals. So it wasn't like he was just sitting at home writing at his desk. He was doing this on airplanes and in hotels. It was not an ideal environment for him to be editing Baba's discourses, but he was making progress. And he said that, this went on for months. And eventually he was in front of Baba at one point, and Baba said, you must be just about ready to publish that new version of the discourses. Isn't it about ready by now? And Don actually lost it a little bit. He said, Baba, I am almost done, but I don't know what good it's all going to do. And boy, Don knew when he said that he'd crossed the line, and he said he didn't know what to do because he'd gone into this territory. And Baba said, "Oh, what do you mean by that, Don?" So he knew he had to either cross the line completely or try to, backpedal or something. He didn't know exactly how to handle it, but he said, I decided to go for it. So he just went over the line, and he said, well, I mean, I know so many spiritually minded people who are honest, sincere seekers of truth and who love you deeply. And they say it's not through words that we get closer to the truth. It's through our behavior. It's through our actions. It's through loving God. And he said, Baba looked very concerned and tired and forlorn. And he said, Don, do they say that about Baba's words? And Don looked at him and said, yes, Baba. And he said, Baba just turned away and didn't even look at Don and looked haggard and started gesturing to Erich. This was after Baba gave up the alphabet board. And Don said this had never happened before, where Baba literally turned away from Don and just started talking to Erich. And this conversation with Erich went on for quite some time, of course, in silence with Baba gesturing. Quite some time means minutes, right? Not hours, minutes, but maybe 15 minutes or something like that. And Erich eventually turned to Don, not Baba. Erich turned to Don. And he said, well, Don, seems you've hit upon something very important here. And I'm even having trouble understanding exactly what Baba's trying to say with his gestures about this. But the best I can gather, and of course, Baba's sitting right there, so Baba's going to fix it or correct it. But he said, the best I can gather from what Baba's trying to tell you here is that you don't understand that when Baba works with one of his mandali on his words in such a way as he's told you with God Speaks and with you on this and other projects like that, he attaches to these words something like an atom bomb of spiritual energy, which when an aspirant works with these words, they will absorb this spiritual energy and it will be of immeasurable help in their spiritual ongoing. And then Don said, then Baba pointed at him like this and said, through Erich, when Baba pointed right at Don, Erich said, and Don, Baba says it's your responsibility to tell Baba's lovers what he's telling you about his words today. And Don said it was extraordinarily powerful to have Baba do this and point at him and share all this. So he basically spent the rest of his life from that period trying to express to Baba's lovers in groups all over the world the importance of Baba's words and working with those words, not just having the book on the bookshelf, but reading Baba's words and trying to absorb that, what Baba has given. Now, the epilogue to the story is fast forward to when I'm working with Don, and people would ask all the time, right, just like 2002 and later, people would ask all the time, what did Baba mean by work with his words? And Don said, well, that's a good question. And it turns out that's a very personal thing, because for one woman, Norma was her name, she tried different things, reading and this and that and the other, and nothing seemed to really work for her. So she sat down and she hand wrote out God Speaks, word by word, on paper. Wow. And she said the effect that it had on her consciousness was so staggering, But the weird thing she said was what she was experiencing had nothing to do with the content of the words. It wasn't like she was having revelations about the meaning of the paragraph or anything like that, but it was having an effect on her consciousness, because that's the way she chose to work with the words that like worked for her. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah, definitely.
It doesn't mean that that's going to work for Gail or for Ginger or for Betty. It just means that's what Norma landed on. That worked for her. For somebody else, like Erico, our old friend Erico, he used to diagram every sentence in God Speaks. Remember diagramming sentences from when you were in school? I mean, who knows what works, right? But I think it's like whatever works for you is what it comes down to. So that's the other story. I told both of them now.
Yeah, wow. You know, when I was in India, there was a lovely German woman who was talking about how she had tried to read the discourses so many times, but she kind of beat herself up about how she couldn't read it or couldn't get it done. And then she started just reading one word a night before she goes to bed. And so she's made it through a couple chapters of the discourse. And she said it totally changed her relationship with the discourses, because it became this like fun, playful one word sentence with Baba.
It's a great way of working with Baba's words.
Yeah. Oh,
I
looks
see
like
a hand up.
Yeah, looks like we got a question. All right, Josh.
Hey, yeah, good to see you, Laurent. I was just wondering, in the new book, is there much to say about Don Stevens' queerness? Because that's sort of a big passion of mine that I'm sort of trying to like discuss and sort of bring out of the darkness, because it seems like, in religions of the past, so often queer people were persecuted and terrorized. And I'm just like wanting to just try and cement in history the discussions around it and sort of bring it out into the light. But yeah.
It's a great question, Josh. The answer is yes, there's quite a bit, because Don and I spearheaded that together in our work together. And of course, I only came along in 2002 to work with Don. And prior to that, Don and Baba worked on that in his own life. Don self-identified as bisexual to me, not as homosexual, although he was labeled all kinds of things by all kinds of people. He did propose to two women, or was interested in marrying two women. He proposed to one who said no, and the other one he talked to about with Baba, and Baba said, she's not the one for you, Don. But he had both male and female relationships. He spent the last 40 years of his life in committed partnership with Claude Longuet, a friend of mine, and his, life companion, wonderful man who now lives in the south of France. So there's quite a bit about it. There's stories about what happened around Charles and Christopher at the Mayher Spiritual Center, terrible suffering that they endured, and how we tried to address that. We wrote a whole book about it called Sexuality on the Spiritual Path, so I addressed that. There's a lot about it. Yes. Does that answer your question, or is there a deeper question?
Yeah, no, it's good to it sounds like it's a teaser, and I'll have to read the book, after buying it. It sounds like you're doing some good salesmanship.
I'm not going to tell it all. It's here it is. It's 886 pages. I hope you enjoy it.
So you better start reading, Josh. So Laurent, I want, you didn't tell us the name of the book. And I think the name of the book is super important.
It's called An Almost Perfect Balance, the authorized biography of Don E. Stevens. And I gave it that title because Meher Baba said, here, it's on the first page of the book. Meher Baba said, Don has an almost perfect balance of head and heart. And so if you start reading God Speaks and discourses with your eyes open for this idea of balance, and see how frequently Baba uses the term balance of mind and heart, or head and heart. It's astonishing. He brings it up over and over again. It's the first part of God Speaks. Before even chapter 1, there's a little quote about it. And in that little tiny quote where it talks about, beads on one string and balancing the head and the heart and all that. But there's quite a bit about it in the Discourse on Love. And Baba says basically that if you try to approach God with just your mind or just your head, you can't do it. It won't work. And he said, if you try to approach God with just your heart, you can do it, but the path will be very slow. And he said, the best of all is to bring a balance of mind and heart in your walk towards God. And that will be the most rapid, and, what Baba was basically indicating is the most healthy approach. So he spoke to Don about it, and he encouraged Don in that way.
So can I ask you a couple of questions on that specific?
Yeah.
So, you spent a lot of time with Don, and what was your experience of that in everyday life? Obviously Baba said that it is true. And so what, did you see that in practice, or was there something about him that worked differently than the rest of us, you could say, that was palpable?
Definitely. Yeah, I can say many things about it. Let me take a couple notes just to make sure I don't miss these points. So there's 3 points I want to cover. One is at dinner, early on my time in London with him, at dinner one night. It was just the two of us at dinner. And I would say things like, Don, we became very casual in our conversation, right, over dinner. I said, Don, I don't quite understand something. You talk about the importance of balancing the mind and the heart based on what Baba told you and what Baba's written about that. But I don't really understand how you do that. And he said, all right, okay. Well, you're in a situation, and before you make any decision, you can ask your mind, well, what do you think about this situation? And then receive that, and still don't make a decision, but ask your heart, and how do you feel about this situation? And then really sit with that and consider both. But as Baba has said, it's the heart that should take the lead, and the mind has its role and its place to be supportive and to provide logic and reason, but that, intuition in the heart should take the lead. And he said, furthermore, if it's important, you should true what you're hearing internally before you make your decision with a close companion or circle of companions who you trust. And by truing, he meant sharing your perception of what you're receiving internally around this situation with somebody you love and trust who's also spiritual. It doesn't have to be a Baba lover, but he lived this. He would receive inner understanding and inner prompting, and then write emails to myself and others asking us to help true his process before he made decisions. So not only was he telling us about his process, he was living it in a day-to-day way and inviting us into that. And that kind of segues into something that's really important to me, which is that he said, you probably have read and heard that Baba would order this one to do that and tell this one this thing. And there was a lot of, Baba telling people what to do. He said, and he called me Little Bear. He didn't call me Laurent, by the way. He said, but Little Bear, it was not like that in my experience at all. He said, it was more like this. Baba would wait to be invited into any aspect of your life before saying anything at all about it. And only then would he make any comment or give you any guidance. And if you did not invite him into that part of your life, he would let you do it your way. And he said, and I know because there were two things. This is Don talking. He said, there were two things that I kept away from Baba for as long as I could. And that was my personal finances and my sex life. And he said, until I had made such a mess of both that I brought them both to Baba. And then he didn't say, you know, well, Don, what took you so long? Or there was no shame, there was no judgment. He just naturally and immediately jumped in with Don and tackled the issues. And he said, and it was wonderful. He was great at both. So it wasn't like, oh, well, spirituality doesn't deal with finances or spirituality doesn't deal with sexuality. Baba was right there with both of them, and they worked it out. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So with that being said, as you saw Don in your life, let's just say financially, it sounds like he had a partner that he was with during your time together. But so what did that look like as far as turning finances over to Baba? Was it just that he trusted that Baba was going to take care of it, or did he have a process?
No. He was allergic to Baba's going to take care of it. That was the antithesis of how Don went about things. So here's an example of finances. I can tell two stories. Let me just put another note here. So one is, this one's a little bit hard to tell, but I'll tell it. Don was living in London, working at the London office of Chevron. And he said Delia de Leon would call him just about every day and spend a lot of time on the phone with Don because she would be worried about this or want to know about that. And it was quite a long conversation. And he felt, because of Delia's position in the Baba community, you know, she was basically the head of the London group, that he had to do this. Well, he said one day, somebody from the American office came to London and had a meeting with him and said, Don, I'm here to tell you something. It's not going to be easy for you to hear. Word's gotten back to the office that you spend quite a bit of time on the phone every day with, you know, non-business conversation, you know, and if you're not careful, you're going to get fired. And Don said it was a shock, like a real shock, because he was completely unprepared for being fired financially. And he said, oh my God. And so he went home and he just thought to himself, my God, what am I doing? I have zero buffer financially, zero cushion. And I need to, you know, figure this out. So, you know, of course, this was right about the time Baba was, you know, advanced in his age, probably in the late 60s at this point. This was right about that time. So Don stopped the calls from Delia coming to work. He said, I can't continue to do this. It's not going to work. And so he set a boundary with Delia. And then he started in 69, actually, going into real estate investment, primarily in France, with his new boyfriend, partner, Claude Longuet. And they started to invest together in things, mostly, you know, apartments and condominiums and things like that. And that worked out great. But the idea was that, you know, in different ways, Don would bring up things with Baba either internally or writing to Baba. But, after Baba passed away in 69, of course, it was all internally. But he would speak to Baba, according to Don, he would speak to Baba in the morning and in the evening, reporting to Baba about what was going on in his life. And he would be completely open to Baba's guidance internally. Another example was he was making enough money at Chevron, and he felt he didn't have any children and he didn't have any dependents. So he felt that he should give some money to Baba from his paycheck on a regular basis. And so Baba said to him, "You feel you want to do that, Don?" This is also in the book, this story. And Don said, "Yes, Baba, I want to do it. I want to help you in your work. And please allow me to give you some money from my paycheck, every paycheck." But Baba was not that interested in this, in the sense that he was very slow to accept this. And a lot of things came up. One was, Baba said, "But Don, what about your mother? Does she have what she needs? Would this impact her in any way?" And Don had to explain his mother's finances and how she would be cared for and how everything was going with her. And then, Baba would say things like, "You see, Don, many people have offered me to give me some money the way you're asking to give me some money, but I almost never allow that. I almost never accept that. And the reason is that they have expectations from me about what that'll mean in return. And I won't do that." He said, "But with you, I will do it. But I have some conditions." So Don said, "Well, like what conditions?" And Bob said, "Well, you're not going to send the money to me. Every time that you have the pay period, I will send you instructions about what to do with that money that you've set aside for me. And I will tell you how to redirect that money to the right person or place. And when I do that, you cannot question me about it or argue with me about it. You just have to do it. If that's not going to work for you, then we probably shouldn't do this." And Don said, "I can do that." And so, it was, the sense of it was that Baba was reluctantly going into this with Don. Only if Baba was certain that it wouldn't impact Don negatively, it wouldn't impact Don's family, and that there wouldn't be any argument about this, and there wouldn't be any expectation about anything in return for Don doing this work. And so they did it. And at one point, Don ended up in a financial bind, and he had to tell Baba, "Look, Baba, this is going to impact me right now. And you have asked me to be honest with you and make sure this wouldn't impact me in any way. But at this juncture, this would make a difference." So Baba and Don worked out a lesser amount of the pay to be used for Baba work. So Baba was flexible, Don was flexible, and it was all about honesty and boundaries and expectations and, purity of intent and all that. It was quite fascinating to hear all this. And that went on for quite a while. Am I answering the questions in the way that you
Yeah,
are
no,
answering?
definitely. I'm just enjoying listening. I'm trying not to interject too much.
Let me ask you, did you know, did he say what Baba asked the money to be used for?
Yeah, that sounds like my old friend Jeff Wolverton there. Hey, brother.
Yeah.
One thing that Don said, I didn't press him because I didn't want to make him uncomfortable because I was just loving the story. I asked the same kind of question, Jeff, and Don made these sort of noises and faces sometimes. He was somewhat childlike in that regard. And he said, "Well, little bear, there were cases where Baba would tell me who to give the money to or what to spend it on for him. And it's good that he told me not to question him, because I did not understand, and it was not an easy thing for me to do. But he didn't tell me. He was quite private in a lot of ways. He was kind of a contradiction. He would be extremely open and revealing in some ways, like about intuitions in his heart and about his, missteps with Baba, where he'd put his foot in his mouth. But in certain other ways, he didn't want to divulge people, or he was very careful not to tarnish or harm anybody's reputation. So it seemed to be maybe people that I might know or have heard about, or situations that might be misunderstood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Laurent, one of my favorite stories is it's the story of when Baba asked Don what he thought about the new life. Do you know the one that I'm talking about?
Yeah, it wasn't Baba, it was Erich.
Oh, okay.
But yes, I do. Do you want me to tell that?
Yeah, would you be open to telling that?
Of course, it's one of my favorite stories too. Do you want the long version or the short version?
Let's do the long one. Why not? We're all here, right, guys? I want head waggles from everybody. Indian head waggles.
So, almost nobody knows this story. It's in the book, but Charmian Deuce, Ivy Deuce's daughter, was very close with Don. And the time came when she wanted to get married, and she wrote to Baba. At that time, Ivy and Charmian were constantly writing to Baba. Every whip stitch, they'd be writing to Baba. So Charmian, I have the letter, by the way, that I'm talking about. Charmian poured out her heart to Baba, that she's ready to get married, and she has this man in mind, and she gives the name of the man and all this. And naturally, she wants Baba's blessing before she makes this decision to marry. And the story that we heard, some of this has not ever been in print, but the story, I have the letter in the book, but the story is that when Baba had the letter read out in Mandalay Hall, he exclaimed, "What? Why doesn't she marry Don? She has a deeper connection to Don." And so this story went around the world, right? Because Baba said it. So Don heard this story, not from Baba, but from it going around the world. And he heard the story and he proposed to Charmian.
Oh my gosh.
Based on him hearing that Baba had said this, he proposed to Charmian. And she said no. I don't think she was happy either about him proposing. But anyway, he did. And so then at some point, it must have been maybe 1970, 69 or 70 maybe. I don't know the exact date, but I have it in the book. Don's with Erich in India and tells Erich this story. And Erich says, "What? You did that? Just based on what Baba said after hearing her letter?" And then Don says, "Yes, I did." And Erich said, "Don, that is really brave. And for that, I will give you a gift." And he said, "The gift I will give you as a result of your bravery is I will finally tell you what you've been asking me to tell you, which is what it was like to be on the new life with Baba." So he said, "Go get your recording equipment and all that." So they sat down, and it took days, according to Don, for Erich to tell this story. And then Erich roped in Mani and Mara and Meru and Goher and whoever else. I think those were the primary women. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong about the women on the New Life. And they captured the story of the new life. And at the end, Eric said, you know, okay, turn off the tape and all that. And at the end, Eric said, well, Don, there, I've told you. Now, what do you think of this new life? And Don said, well, Eric, I'm astonished when I hear all this, the hardship and the what you had to endure. I don't know how you could have done it. And Eric said, oh, well, Don, then I've failed you. And Eric said, no. Don said, no, Eric, no. Why do you say that? And Eric said, no, Don, I've failed you because I've failed to communicate to you the glory of companionship with the avatar of the age. And there's no way I could communicate to you what it was like to have Baba as a spiritual companion. And that's why I failed you. And so Don was extremely impacted by this. And the rest of his life, Don was reoriented towards spiritual companionship with Baba, and not so much Baba as a spiritual master or as God even, but as the elder brother, the spiritual companion that Baba was with the Mandali on the new life. It was extremely impactful.
Beautiful.
I love that story. Something else I wanted to ask you about is, so I've heard that Don was one of the few people, and correct me if I'm wrong, was one of the few people who could cable Baba at any time. And could you talk a little bit more about that? You know, how that arose, if that was true or not, what the situation?
No, that's not true. It was much deeper than that. What happened was, after Baba met Don for the first time in New York City in 1952, Baba started referring to Don as his son and as his spiritual son, which is in the book here. And if you look up in the discourses, the phrase spiritual son, it only appears one time in the discourses. And the gist of it is Baba said, the disciple who obeys the master 100% becomes the spiritual son of the master, and in due time becomes a master himself. It's the only place he uses the phrase spiritual son in the discourses. And then he used spiritual son in one other place, which is also in the book, which is when he was talking about certain saints in India. He called certain saints his spiritual sons or his sons. And so Don was in a category of very few people in the world in the way Baba spoke about him and treated him. And so what he said to Don wasn't about cabling. What he said was, Don, when you're anywhere near India, you come and you be with me. You do not have to cable me, write to me, call me, you just come. And the number of people who had this open door policy to walk in on Baba, I mean, there were a few people. Balna too had it. A few other people had it, but almost nobody had this kind of access to Mayor Baba. So Don said he would literally just walk into Mandali Hall, unannounced. And so Baba would be in the middle of talking about something when Don would walk in. That's how casual it would be. And he said sometimes he'd walk in and Baba would say, oh, good, Don, we're playing cards. Come join us. I mean, it was that incredible.
So how many, is there a count of how many times Don saw Baba in the body?
No, he lost track. Wow.
What a life.
That brings up one of my favorite stories. Can I tell one of my other favorite stories?
Yeah.
He said, you know, he started to think about it once. He said, every time I would arrive, Baba would give me a hug and sometimes kiss me on the cheek or kiss me on the neck. And then when I would leave, he'd also say, come over here. And he'd give Don a hug and a kiss. And so he said, boy, I must have racked up quite a few hugs and kisses from Baba. He couldn't even count how many, right? But he said one time, only one time, Baba said, "Come here, Don," and gave him a big hug and a big kiss on the cheek before he left. And Don said, "I went to the taxi that was waiting because, he was prepared to go. And he put his bag in the taxi and he got into the back seat of the taxi, and the taxi started to roll out of Marazad there, crunching down the driveway. And one of the Mandali comes running, "Don, Don, Don." And Don says, "Yeah," rolls down the window. What? And the Mandali says, "Baba's calling you, Baba's calling you." So he jumps out of the taxi, runs back into Mandali Hall. And Baba says, "Come," and gives him another big hug, big kiss. And Don says, "Wow, this never happened before. This is great." And then so he gets back to the taxi, and they start to roll. And again, another Mandali comes over. "Don, Don, Don, Baba's calling you." And he goes, "What?" And now it's getting really unusual, right? So he says, "Okay." So he jumps out of the taxi, goes to Baba, and Baba says, "Come, come," and gives him this big hug and a big kiss, and sends Don off. And then Don gets in the taxi, and this time he rolls away. 3 hugs and 3 kisses. And he gets back to London. And shortly after, he gets a call from Delia that Baba's passed away. And he said, Baba knew.
Wow. I just got chills. That's so beautiful. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
speechless. Oh, goodness. Oh, Josh has got his hand up again.
It's so funny the way it's on the top of that sheet. It looks like you've got a white arm. Go ahead, Josh.
All right, Josh, let's hear it.
Yeah, I was wondering because it's interesting. I think God Speaks in the Discourses are such interesting books in that, like, God Speaks is very metaphysical, and then the Discourses is sort of very sort of difficult by current Western standards. So yeah, like, what do you think is their role in this purpose of sort of time? Because like I can't think of I love Baba greatly, lovely, but I can't think of any two other books that like my other so-called spiritual friends would find less relevant to their lives. I mean, some bits of discourses are really great, but yeah, like the modern, like sort of like this young spiritual community, I don't think they'd be any, like the young people don't even want to hear about it. Like what I'm interested to hear what you think about that, what your call is on that. If you have any ideas, obviously, it's all a bit of guesswork, but yeah.
So I've been introducing young people to Meher Baba and God Speaks in Discourses since 1986. And I've had quite a different experience around that. The ones who I've had the pleasure to introduce to Baba have gotten tremendous amount of guidance and light and love out of both of those books. To be fair, some gravitate more to Discourses than God Speaks. I understand that. But I have a young man in Chicago who I brought to Baba recently through a long story, but he reads the Discourses and he says he has blissful experiences reading Baba's words in Discourses, and he wants to discuss it. And he's looking for people to discuss it. And like you're saying, people of his own generation aren't that interested, but he's 20-something and just loving it. So yes. I think
send me his email because I'm in the same boat,
Sure, I will. If you could email me, I'll put it in the chat here for you. But I'm onpoint@gmail.com here. Where's the chat? Here we go. Email me and I'll hook you guys up. The other thing to think about is that, Baba made it clear he wrote Discourses with his Mandali primarily for the new humanity. And he said, God Speaks was the most important book in the world today. And he said, because technology was at its height and science was at its height, and the forces of Maya were at their height. This book should also be released and balance that out with, the revelation of God. And he said, humanity would look upon God Speaks not as a book from a philosopher or a holy man, but as the words of God. And so I think it's just a matter of time before humanity wakes up to these works and respects them for what they are. I think Jeff has a question.
Yes. Oh, Jeff, you're muted.
You said the two topics that Don Stevens kind of shied away from bringing up with Bob, the finances and the other sexuality.
That's right.
So you gave us a little bit about the finances. What did he say to Don about sexuality?
Right. So this is very, very important, what you're asking, Jeff. What's fascinating is, according to Don, Baba never told him not to have any kind of sexual relationship, never said don't be bisexual or don't have a homosexual relationship or don't do this or don't do that. That was not what happened. He said there was one particular case, and he asked me not to name the name, but he said there was one particular case where Baba said, Don, I know your nature. And your nature is to do anything and everything to make sure a relationship will succeed and last. He said, but I also know his nature. And I want you to promise me that if this relationship starts to undermine your physical health, that you will turn your back on the relationship and not look back. And Don said to me, Little Bear, I didn't know why he was saying this, but I did promise. And he said, it turned out exactly like Baba said. The relationship got worse and worse until I had to check with my own body. And it was true. It was undermining my physical health. Baba knew. So I had to end the relationship. And so, Don made it extraordinarily clear when explaining the story. The guidance wasn't about them both being male. It was about Don's experience of his physical health. And I think that's a very important distinction, that it was about what was best. Really, I think best for all concerned is one way to say it, but what was best for Don in this case. Does that make any sense, Jeff?
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah. Hey, Tony. Hey, brother.
Hey, Laurent, I'm really enjoying this so much. And your book just came in the mail.
Oh, dear Baba, dear Baba, dear Baba, dear Baba.
Wait, two things. One, I was there at Lake Balaton when, with the gathering with his companions. When Don, at the very end, it seemed to me for the first time, openly shared these two things about his sex life and his finances. And it was staggering, because I'd never heard Don openly talk about his life at all, let alone something. And so when I got back to New York, I had a UN conference after the Balaton. But when I got back to New York, I put my love life in Baba's hands. And my life has not been the same since. And the thing is, yes, in relationship terms, it was a bit of a roller coaster, and then to where I am now. But also, when you say I put my love life in your hands, that's a lot bigger than just any particular relationship. It's about your love, your expression of love, experience of love. So it's a very powerful thing, and I remain eternally grateful that Baba had me there just at that moment. The other thing, it was just not as important, but I remember Don talking about Jung. And at some point, I don't remember specifically, I think they had a friend who was a Jungian therapist, and he was very engaged in that. Is any of that stuff in the book? Because I don't remember it all.
Oh, it certainly is. And I can say a lot about it, and I can add something that you might like to hear.
I'd love to hear
Don was in Jungian therapy with Elizabeth Whitney. That's in the book. When she was ready to hand him off, she handed him to Joseph Henderson. Both Elizabeth Whitney and Joseph Henderson are giants in the Jungian community, well known. And then Don studied it on his own, Jungian teaching and understanding. And then in my papers, I came across a talk that Don gave in 1952 to a psychiatric association in San Francisco about Jung and Hazrat Inayat Khan. So he was linking Sufism and Jungian understanding. So I have that paper if you'd like to read that. It's a beautiful paper.
I would love to. I'll put my email in the chat. Is that good?
Can you just email me? I put mine, ownpoint@gmail.com, and then I'll get you a copy of it.
Yep. What reminded me was Baba Don talking about how do you balance mind and heart, and first ask your mind, but what do you think about this, and heart, how do you feel about this? And it's sort of it has a Jungian flavor, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And it's I've done a lot of work with Jungian principles over the years, and it's very helpful in relationship with Baba also.
It is. We could probably talk all day about Jung and Baba. Nora Moore wrote a book about Jung and Baba.
Who was that?
I was involved in that project. So if you're interested in what she had to say, you could read her book.
What's her name?
Nora Moore, Norah, and then Moore. She wrote a book. I think it's called The Sound of Bells, something like that.
Sounds great.
So just because we're starting to get a little bit to that time, does anybody else have any questions before I ask Laurent my final question? No, and if you guys come up with one afterwards, that's okay. But Laurent, would you be willing to share your favorite experience of time with Don? Because I feel like what I love about hearing the stories of the Mahabali is not necessarily who they were, because who they are is Baba, but it's the practice of God in the present, and they did that so well. And so do you have an example of your favorite story of where you were seeing that in real time?
That's a tough one. A favorite?
Or like the one that stuck out the most?
Of my time with Don?
Yeah.
There's so many. I'll tell one. I can't rank them. I can't find a favorite. There's just too many, but I'll just tell this one. He wanted to go to Dehradun, which is up north of Delhi. And it was the northernmost part of Baba's new life. He went all the way up to Dehradun from Merazad, well, walking and on bullock carts and stuff. It would have been an enormous journey from Merazad. But he went all the way up to Dehradun and back. I don't know how they did that. And so we were at the northernmost part. But to get to Dehradun, we were in Delhi, and he wanted to take a train. And I said, Don, that's going to be a very long train journey from Delhi to Dehradun. It's going to be a little rough. And he was very open to discussion. You know, it wasn't like my way or the highway at all with him. And I said, why don't we just rent a car and get a driver and just drive there? It would be probably much more enjoyable. So he said, okay. So we got a car, and it's a long drive. I mean, my goodness. And there's no way we could have driven from Delhi to Dehradun in one fell swoop. So we drove halfway and spent the night. And on the drive, of course, this was like a Jeep kind of situation with no seatbelts, a seatbelt in India. And so I sat in the back seat. It was like a bench seat with Don. And I put my arm around his neck and over his shoulder so that I was his seatbelt. So that if there was any jerking motion or problems, I could keep him safe. And he liked that. He liked that kind of, well, it was creative, but it was also affection, right? Because I was touching him. So it was like I was being bold and I was making a creative solution. I felt I needed to do it. And I said to the driver, hey, driver was pretty young, like 20 something. I said, hey, you need to drive extremely carefully, be very mindful, because we have precious cargo in the back seat here. And everybody started laughing. Mm-hmm. And it turned out we were in a very dicey stretch, and there was a car accident right in front of us. It happened right in front of us. And the driver had to swerve right around this car accident very violently. And it's a good thing I was holding on to Don, because we were both going, whoa. And then we got eventually to the halfway point, and then we got the next day up to Dehradun. And there's quite a thriving community up in Dehradun, Baba community. So Don would take with him, wherever we went, he would take with him the sadra that Baba gave him. You may or may not know, but one day Baba took off his sadra. If you rewind to 1960s, one day Baba took off his sadra and gave it to Mara and said, save this for Don for the next time he comes, and remember the date. So the next time Don came to Marazad, the sadra came back out, and Mara said to Don, Baba took off this sadra on January 14th, which was Don's birthday. So
wow.
Baba was remembering Don on Don's birthday by taking off his sadra as a gift for Don. And this was presented to Don. So he took this everywhere we went. He took this with him in a very simple terry cloth bag. Inside the terry cloth bag was the sadra. And then the terry cloth bag was in his suitcase with a few other things. And he would take it out whenever we would be with Baba lovers. He would take it out because he wanted people to experience it. So we're going to this Baba center in Dehradun, and it's packed. Everybody wants to hear Don talk. And when we would do this, he would put me in charge of taking the sadra out and putting it away and all that kind of stuff. And I would take a chair so that it would be Don, and then I'd sit next to Don because he always wanted me to sit next to him. And then I'd put another chair and I'd put the sadra on it as if Baba was sitting in the chair with us, so there'd be a third chair. And then people would come up and take the hem of the sadra, put it on their forehead, or take the sleeve of the sadra, or whatever, they'd have their time with Baba. Well, in the middle of the talk, the lights went out, the power went out, and it was pitch black. I'd never been in this situation in a Baba meeting before. And it was lots of people. And within about 15 seconds, all these lighters went on, and then candles. It was like everywhere, lighters and candles. And suddenly the whole room was filled with light again from candles. So we just resumed the meeting. That was incredible. And then at the end of the meeting, there was always like a kind of a little huddle or throng around Don. People wanted to talk to Don and all that. And I would just let them do that while I was putting away the sadra. And so the sadra is all ready to go, and I'm just waiting for Don to be done. And he's almost done. And then a couple walked in. And you could tell they were feeling a little sheepish because they were so late. They were right at the tail end of the entire experience. and they kind of did this, you know, facial gesture looking at this terry cloth bag with the sadra. They must have known something was going on, or somebody said something about it. I said, "Oh, you want to see Baba's sadra?" And, you know, and I looked, and it was a couple, and she had like a baby bump, so she must have been pregnant. So I took out the sadra, and I knew Don's feelings. He always wanted people to have an experience of Baba. He was like antithetical to museum, you know, treatment of Baba's things. He didn't want things under glass. He didn't want them to be removed from people. He wanted them to experience. So I was bold, and I took out the sadra and I threw it. I literally threw it. And the way it happened, the arms went out and around her, and the sadra fell over her belly and down. And it was like Baba was hugging her. I don't know how it happened, but it looked like Baba was giving her this big hug. And they just looked at me, and they looked at each other. And then I took the sadra back off of her and I put it away. But that's what it was like. It was very real and experiential.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing and telling all your stories. This has been nice to just sit and
Thank you for listening. I hope they were good stories.
They were very good stories.
Excellent.
Well, Laurent, thank you so much for your time. And thank you, everybody who joined.
Thanks for having me, Margie. Thank you, Jeff.
I know every late night chat, it's the late night chat with Jeff Wolverton, and then maybe Margi Connor, maybe Peter Goodman, and maybe Vesta. All right. Well, with that, guys, I think we're probably going to close up for the night. So we'll just end with the moment of silence and then an avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai.